Lingchi, which is better known in the Western world as death by 1,000 cuts, is one of the few ways of execution that has ever inspired as much fear and curiosity as it has. It was a form of capital punishment that was carried out in China until it was abolished in the early 20th century. It was well known for the tremendous severity of the punishment as well as the symbolic power it possessed. Lingchi, on the other hand, was not only a method of cruel punishment. It was a public spectacle with enormous societal ramifications, and it was enmeshed into the complex matrix of ancient Chinese society and the ideas that society had regarding issues of justice, power, and the afterlife. It served as a punitive system, a deterrent, and a societal mirror, reflecting attitudes on crime, punishment, and power. Its aim was to prevent criminal activity. Where did this punishment come from? Lingchi may be traced back to the Tang dynasty, but it did not become a particularly significant type of capital punishment until the later Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties. Lingchi dates back to the Tang dynasty. The society of Imperial China was constructed on the basis of a rigid hierarchical structure, with the emperor serving as the son of heaven at the very top of the social order. He was considered to be the pinnacle of all authority and was seen as the connecting factor between heaven and earth. In declining order of esteem, the scholar officials, peasants, artisans, and merchants made up the intricate social system that existed underneath him. A complete, complex, and meticulous criminal code served as the foundation for this era's legal system. This codification was a direct result of the need for order and hierarchy that existed within the bureaucratic society of the time. The severity of the punishments was based on a variety of variables, such as the social status of the offender, the social status of the victim, the nature of the crime, and the purpose behind it. Within the confines of this matrix, Lingchi arose as a form of punishment that was reserved for the gravest of offenses, including high treason, patricide, matricide, or the killing of one's master or employer. It was believed that the terrible nature of Lingchi, both in terms of its process and its spectacle, would dissuade people who might commit crimes in the future, while also exhibiting the strength of the state and its ability to take ultimate revenge. In addition, the exercise had spiritual ramifications that were connected to ancient Chinese beliefs about the body, soul, and afterlife. The progressive dismemberment procedure was not only used as a kind of physical torture, but also as a method for inflicting damage on the victim's spirit. It was believed that a body that had been deformed or was missing parts could not find peace in the afterlife. This belief added an additional terrifying aspect to the punishment that was being meted out. How was death by 1,000 cuts carried out? The Lingchi practice consisted of a carefully choreographed public display that was intended to cause the participant as much anguish and humiliation as possible. In spite of the fact that the precise number of slashes might differ from case to case, everyone agreed that this was one of the most painful and drawn-out methods of capital punishment. The premise was straightforward. The condemned person's final moments were to be spent in as much torment as possible in order to maximize both the deterrent effect and the vengeance meted out to them. The convicted person was often hung from a wooden frame in a public spot, frequently in the vicinity of a marketplace or city gate, where crowds could congregate to watch the spectacle. This public display was an essential component of the punishment. The purpose of the punishment was not simply to inflict physical suffering on the culprit. Rather, it was to communicate to society as a whole the repercussions that come with committing serious crimes. The purpose of the entire procedure was to serve as a stern warning to avoid engaging in such horrible activities in the future. The person carrying out the execution would begin the procedure by making a series of cuts on the victim's body. These cuts would begin in less key sections of the body and gradually move to more crucial areas of the body. The purpose of this calculated progression was to make the duration of the punishment last for as long as feasible, while also delaying the onset of death for as long as possible. The incisions were made in such a way as to inflict severe suffering without causing the victim's death right away. Some reports claim that certain body parts, such as the heart, were preserved until the very end of the process, but other versions state that certain body parts, such as the limbs, were amputated prior to the beginning of the cutting process. Throughout the entire procedure, measures were made to ensure that the sufferer did not lose consciousness as a result of shock or blood loss, which would have prolonged their agony. In spite of the cruel nature of its inhabitants, Lingchi was also subject to a set of regulations. If the sentenced person was put to death by the executioner too swiftly, for instance, the executioner could be held accountable for their actions. The executioner was put in an unusually difficult position because of this, because they had to inflict extreme anguish without accidentally causing the victim's death. The condemned were eventually put to death, which put an end to their bodily torture. Nevertheless, it did not put an end to their social stigma. In many instances, the remains were not given a proper burial, which, within the context of ancient Chinese beliefs about death and the afterlife, was a final act of dishonor and an act that caused spiritual damage. Why this was such a horrible punishment? When investigating the sociocultural effects of Lingchi, it is essential to take into account the complexities of old-fashioned Chinese society. Lingchi was considerably more than a form of death. Rather, it was a potent societal tool that sent lessons about power, obedience, and the repercussions of violating societal standards. Lingchi was used to execute people, but it also served as a great educational tool. The extremely public nature of Lingchi played an important role in the communication of this information. The ceremony was frequently held in public settings like markets or city gates, so assuring that a huge audience was present. This was a strategic decision, with the grisly scene serving as a jarring reminder of the grave repercussions that result from committing horrible crimes. The ceremonial aspect of the punishment, the methodical dissection, and the drawn-out, protracted death were all elements that contributed to the production of a show that was intended to instill terror and demand obedience from those who witnessed it. The ritual of dismembering the dead body in Lingchi had important repercussions for the culture. Mutilating the human body was regarded as a form of disobedience to one's parents in traditional Chinese culture, since it was believed that the human body was a sacred gift from one's parents. In addition, people of that time believed that an imperfect or scarred body would not be able to find peace in the afterlife. This facet of Lingchi inflicted spiritual damage that went beyond the physical anguish and humiliation felt by the condemned. As a result, the sentence was a form of retribution that crossed over into the realm of the afterlife. Who received this penalty was also determined in part by the social and cultural dynamics of the time and place. In most cases, the sentence of Lingchi was reserved for the most serious of crimes, like as high treason or crimes committed against family members, which were seen as offenses against the state or the natural order, respectively. It was a reflection of how the society placed a high value on filial piety and allegiance to the emperor. In the broad scheme of things, Lingchi was a representation of the norms, values, and ideas that pervaded society during that era. It was a stark illustration of how a community went about preserving order and hierarchy, complete with unmistakable warnings about the importance of authority, obedience, and filial piety, as well as the repercussions of acting contrary to these values. Famous victims of Lingchi. In the course of Chinese history, there are a few cases of Lingchi that stand out as particularly remarkable, either because of the people who were engaged or because of the impact that they had on society and law. The case of Fang Yiji, a scholar and scientist who lived during the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, is remembered as one of the most infamous of all time. In Chinese academic circles, Fang was a significant figure noted for his contributions to the fields of astronomy, mathematics, and geography. However, his outspoken criticism of the Manchu overlords contributed to his undoing and ultimately led to his removal from power. In the year 1665, he was found guilty of inciting a rebellion and sentenced to Lingchi. The case of Fang is frequently used as an example of the application of the punishment against political dissidents. This highlights the role that the punishment plays in suppressing resistance and keeping control over the narrative of power. In the later years of the Qing dynasty, there was another notable incident that involved a guy named Wang Weiqin. Wang was a slave who was responsible for the deaths of his master's family. Lingchi handed down the death sentence to him because of the exceptionally heinous nature of his offense, which consisted of violating the hierarchical connection that existed between the master and the servant. The circumstances surrounding his case highlighted the use of punishment in maintaining social hierarchy and the harsh consequences that come with crossing these boundaries. The last person to be given the Lingchi punishment was a Mongolian guard named Fuju Li, who was hanged in 1905 for the murder of a Mongolian royal who was his employer. These images, which were taken by a French soldier at the time of the execution, were some of the most clear documentation of the practice and largely contributed to the uproar against it on a global scale. Why Lingchi was finally banned. It is possible to ascribe the abolition of Lingchi to a variety of circumstances, both internal and international, and it is tightly connected with China's greater historical shift at the beginning of the 20th century. In the latter half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, China found itself falling more and more under the sway of Western powers. Significant social and political shifts occurred during this time period in China as the country worked to modernize and reform its institutions in an effort to fortify itself against incursions from other countries. These changes weren't confined to only the military or the economy. Rather, they encompassed the social and judicial systems as well. There was a growing recognition among Chinese intellectuals and reformists that certain ancient practices, especially forms of punishment like Lingchi, were perceived as backward by Western powers and were hurting China's progress and status on the global arena. This knowledge came about as a result of the perception that certain traditional practices were seen as backward by Western powers. The dissemination of images of a Lingchi execution that had been taken in 1905 by a French soldier provided the final impetus for the termination of the practice. The photographs, which showed the execution of a criminal named Fuju Li, were widely disseminated in the Western Hemisphere, which resulted in an international outrage against the practice and increased the amount of pressure that was placed on the Qing administration. As a result of these pressures, both internal and external, the Qing administration finally gave in and abolished Lingchi in 1905. This step was taken as a component of broader judicial changes that were enacted with the intention of modernizing the Chinese legal system and bringing it into closer alignment with the legal principles of the West. It was a huge step towards more humane forms of punishment and marked the end of one of the most infamous and terrible types of capital punishment in the history of the world when it was abolished. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.